Before we begin, this story contains descriptions of occupational death, institutional fraud, and the deliberate targeting of vulnerable workers, including falsified death records and burials without headstones. If that's something you need to step away from today, we understand. Take care of yourself first. This episode's narration is AI-generated. The research, writing, and editorial decisions behind every story are made with care for accuracy and respect for those involved. Somewhere in the summer of 1930, a man pressed a wet cloth against his mouth and walked into a mountain. Inside, strung electric bulbs had become dim halos almost immediately, swallowed by white dust so thick it had its own weight. The man working the drill 10 feet in front of him was invisible. He could hear him, the compressed air percussion hammering through solid rock. He moved toward the sound. The rock wasn't grey or brown. It was white, almost luminescent. 98% pure silicon dioxide, though nobody had told the workers that. In 6 months, he'd be dead. The death certificate would say pneumonia. You're listening to the Unlit Room. Every story in here actually happened. That's the part that should scare you. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Today, how a construction company drilled a tunnel through a West Virginia mountain, killed nearly 500 workers, and paid an average of $80 per life to make the lawsuits disappear. The place was Gay W. Lee Mountain, West Virginia. The time was 1927. Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation, one of the largest industrial companies in America, needed to divert water from the New River to power a new ferro-alloy plant near the town of Alloy. A ferro-alloy plant refines the metal alloys used to make steel. To do that, it needed a tunnel, 3 3/4 miles long, 46 feet wide, drilled through the solid core of a mountain. They contracted the job to a company called Rye Knee Hart and Dennis. And in 1929, before work began, Rye Knee Hart and Dennis commissioned geological surveys of the tunnel route. The surveys came back with one finding that should have stopped everything. The rock inside Gay W. Lee Mountain for most of the tunnel's length was nearly pure silicon dioxide, 98 to 99% silica, the whitest, most dangerous kind of rock a miner can drill. Silicon dioxide is one of the most common minerals on Earth. It's also, when inhaled as fine crystalline dust, one of the most lethal. The particles are microscopic, small enough to pass through the body's defenses and reach the deepest air sacs of the lung. Once there, they can't be removed. The body responds by laying down scar tissue. Over years, the scarring spreads, the lungs harden, and eventually a person can no longer draw a full breath. The disease is called silicosis. By 1930, silicosis was already documented in medical literature. It was a recognized occupational hazard for miners and quarry workers in America and Europe. A known risk of drilling rock. Rye Knee Hart and Dennis received the geological surveys. They read them, they filed them, and in the spring of 1930, they sent labor recruiters south. Gay W. Lee Bridge, West Virginia, sits at the confluence of the Gay W. Lee and New Rivers, surrounded by steep forested ridges that rise sharply on every side. In 1930, it was a small river town that most Americans had never heard of. One railroad stop, a post office, a hardware store. That spring, it became the staging ground for one of the largest private construction projects in West Virginia's history. Micro Cliffhanger 1. The men recruited to build it had been told they were going to lay railroad track. None of them had been told what was inside the mountain. Knee Hart and Dennis's recruiters had gone specifically to Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, targeting black men who'd been working as sharecroppers and tenant farmers, promising steady industrial wages and steady work. At peak operation, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 men worked the Hawk's Nest project. Approximately 2/3 of them were black migrants from the South. They were housed in segregated company camps near the tunnel entrance, in conditions that were notably worse than those provided to white workers. Different barracks, different mess arrangements. A visible, documented hierarchy built into the camp from the start. There was no union. There was no labor attorney in Nicholas County, West Virginia, who had their names on file. In the rural South they'd come from, they were tenant farmers. Here, they were contract labor for a company that answered to Union Carbide, operating in a county where they had no political standing, no legal network, no way to organize, and no one to organize with. The men chosen to drill the most dangerous rock in the project were the men who couldn't leave, couldn't sue, and couldn't be heard if they tried. That wasn't incidental to the project, it was integral to it. Silicosis normally takes between 10 and 30 years to develop. A hard rock driller breathing dust across a full career might start coughing in middle age. The scarring is slow, the symptoms arrive late. By the time a doctor diagnoses it, the exposure is usually a decade old. That was the assumption that every industrial health study before 1930 was built on. Micro cliffhanger 2. Nobody had documented what happened when the exposure wasn't years, when the concentration was 1,000 times the threshold. Inside those barracks, men were starting to find out. Drilling began in March of 1930. Inside the tunnel, conditions exceeded every known safe exposure standard. Workers ran compressed air percussion drills in dry rock, meaning no water sprayed onto the drill bits to suppress airborne particles. That technique, wet drilling, was already standard at comparable hard rock mining operations in the United States. At Hawk's Nest, it wasn't used. Dry drilling was faster. After each shift ended, ventilation equipment wasn't run before the next crew entered. Men went back into air still heavy with the previous shift's dust. Workers pressed wet handkerchiefs against their mouths, against crystalline silica particles fine enough to slip past the deepest filters in the human lung. A wet cloth did nothing. Foreman E.J. Perkins later testified before Congress about conditions inside the bore. His description was precise. You couldn't see a man working 10 feet away from you. Workers navigated by voice and by the sound of drilling. The dust had its own visibility. Later estimates put the particle concentration inside the tunnel at between 30,000 and 40,000 particles per cubic centimeter. The concentration at which prolonged crystalline silica exposure becomes lethal, approximately 5,000. Men began dying within 6 to 18 months of starting work, not in a decade, in months. Workers who'd arrived from South Carolina and Georgia in their 30s, healthy, able-bodied men who'd spent their lives doing physical labor, were found in their bunks unable to rise. They coughed mucus-tinged white. They lost weight until their clothes hung slack. Some collapsed at their stations inside the tunnel. The company physicians at the work camps filled out the death certificates. On virtually everyone, the cause of death was recorded as pneumonia. Some read tunnelitis, a term with no medical definition, apparently invented for these particular certificates. Not silicosis. Never silicosis. Because a death certificate reading silicosis would have required explaining what silicosis was, and how hundreds of men contracted it while drilling one tunnel in a single year. Families in South Carolina and Georgia had been getting letters. Then the letters stopped, and then there was nothing. Micro cliffhanger 3. By 1932, some of those families had found lawyers. Civil suits were being filed, and the company had 2 answers ready. Answers they'd been building toward since the geological surveys came back in 1929. The first answer, what happened at Hawk's Nest, was unforeseeable. Riney, Hart and Dennis argued in the early civil suits that acute silicosis, the rapid onset form caused by extreme short-term dust exposure, had not been well documented in American medical literature before 1930. They couldn't have predicted that 6 months in this particular tunnel would compress a 30-year disease into 18 months. The second answer, presented at the 1936 congressional hearings, was that the death count was inflated. At the time of the hearings, only 109 deaths could be formally documented. The numbers being cited by advocates, 300, 500, were speculation built on incomplete records. Both positions held for decades. The evidence to counter them was scattered across falsified death certificates, settled claims files, and a burial field outside Summersville with no permanent record of who was in it. It wasn't until 1986, 55 years after the tunnel was completed, that historian Martin Chair Ni-Ak published the definitive accounting. Drawing on court records, settlement files, and death certificates, Chair Ni-ak estimated 476 dead, 764 documented claimants. The inflated count position didn't survive the archives, and the unforeseeable position, that one the evidence dismantles on its own. Here is what was in the geological surveys Rai Hart and Dennis filed in 1929. The surveys sitting in a file before the first drill was assembled. The tunnel route ran through rock that was 98 to 99% silicon dioxide. They knew the composition of the rock before construction began. Silicosis was not a mystery in 1930. It had been documented in American and European medical literature since at least 1917. Wet drilling, the technique that suppresses airborne silica by spraying water directly onto the drill bit, was already standard practice at comparable mines and tunnel projects in the United States. The decision to use dry drilling at Hawk's Nest was not a gap in available knowledge. Dry drilling was faster. Faster meant the tunnel was completed ahead of schedule. And completing ahead of schedule meant Union Carbide's alloy plant came online sooner and started generating revenue sooner. The nearly 500 men who died in those barracks and that field didn't die because the company didn't know. They died because the company ran the numbers, weighed the timeline, and made a choice. Before the 1936 hearings could establish legal liability, Rai Hart and Dennis dispatched settlement agents to the barracks where men were still dying. They came with cash and papers. The offer, between $30 and $80 per worker, in exchange for a signed release of all future claims. The men who signed were the ones still alive and still sick, gasping, unable to work, with no union to advise them and no attorney to read the papers. Some signed with an X. Total settlement payments across 764 claimants came to approximately $130,000. No criminal charges were ever filed against Union Carbide or Rai Hart and Dennis. No executive was prosecuted. No regulatory penalty was imposed. The black migrants from South Carolina and Georgia and Virginia, the men who'd been promised railroad work and sent into pure silica dust instead, were buried in a segregated field outside Summersville, West Virginia, a parcel of land Rai Hart and Dennis purchased specifically for that purpose. Some accounts document burials without coffins. No permanent record was kept of who was buried there or where. The tunnel is still there. It still generates hydroelectric power. There is no memorial at Hawk's Nest for the nearly 500 men who drilled it. When accountability is measured in dollars, the price is a statement about what a working man's life is worth. In 1932, Union Carbide's answer was $80. If this one kept you up tonight, good. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Subscribe so the next one finds you too. Follow the Unlit Room wherever you listen. Tell a friend who can't sleep. Full story on the main channel. Follow if you're wide awake. That was the Unlit Room. See you in the dark.